Can you tell us more about Dagestan and its internal controversies?
Yes, actually, Dagestan was never a state or a political state with its boundaries. It was a mental unity, a mental area where lots of ethnic minorities with their own languages lived. And of course, there was separation between mountaineers and people living on plains, and now more deep and profound differences between people living there, because there is an eternal fight between different local brands of Islam, between different ethnic groups, or maybe clans and political unions. And I think the most big gap and the most big struggle is going on in the brains and in the consciousness of people, and first of all of people of my age.
You are in your 20s.
I'm already 28. So people of my age, after Soviet Union's breakdown, they went abroad and studied in different Muslim countries, and when they returned back home, they discovered that their relatives are not following Islamic rules. And that caused and led to generation gap and all this controversy in minds. It's strange that there are only two groups of people in Russia who have a strong idea, national idea. I think these are so-called Salafis, those so-called forest brothers who fight against the secular war and who believe that only independent Islamic State will solve all the problems of bribery and lawlessness. And these are so-called skinheads who are against invaders from Caucasus and Russia, for example. So these two groups of people, in fact, I don't think that they are enemies. They are very alike because they have very clear and very definite perception of what is to be done to approach to paradise on earth. And they are very romantic and, on the other hand, absolutely ignorant. And, of course, there are people who use these romantic people on mercenary ends, involve them and drag them into these groups. Families are split between those who are for secular way of life and for staying in Russia, and there are young men who insist on separating and creating independent Islamic State, and who believe that it will be an absolute decision of all the problems.
But overall, the Dagestani people, what do they associate themselves with? With Russia, with Dagestan, with secular or with Sharia state?
I think after Soviet Union's collapse, there was a short period when the belief in probable European and independent Dagestan was alive. But very soon it became obvious it's not possible, and that it's more rational and more expedient to stay with Russia. And now the majority of population of Caucasus, of course, vote for being with Russia.
But how have these views and perceptions changed since the collapse of the Soviet Union?
In spite of these 75 years of Soviet times, Dagestan was never truly Muslim area, and Sharia law was always feeble and frail in Dagestan and incompatible with local rules called adats. And Dagestan always consisted of different unions, feudal princedoms, and of so-called free alliances or free communities with democratical norms of life. So after Gorbachev's perestroika, it turned out that again, young people, they know next to nothing about their own history and about their communities because their parents already had moved from mountains to towns on plain, and they have abandoned their national costumes, their traditions and mother tongues. And that is why people of my age, they don't know who they are. They don't have this strong identification. That world of ancient Dagestan was in fact very far from being strictly conservative Muslim world. It was an ancient relic world full of creativity, full of poetic sense of life, although it was severe, austere, and very full of war.
What about the role of women in Dagestan?
Women were always maybe more free than men because the most of household depended only on them. Men were always somewhere fighting or discussing politics, and a woman in Dagestan was a sort of sacred creature who only she had an access to fields, to some areas in house, to many important parts of life. And there are villages where girls even could choose their husbands. When they became mature, they stand on the special roof in the village, announced that they were ready to get married, and chose a partner. And if he didn't want to marry her, he had to pay a contribution. And it was all written in the law. They were far from being Sharia laws, where the role of woman is complete different.
What is it nowadays? Is the trend changing because you have this forest brotherhood? And are there many women who actually cover themselves with burqas or try to adhere to the Sharia law?
Last several years I live in Moscow, but I often come to Dagestan, and I have a chance to see how rapidly it is changing and how the number of covered women is increasing. Most of all, these are young women, girls who fall in love with religious men and who are easily persuaded to wear the special garments. And of course, these girls, they don't know about those old oral laws of Dagestan. The woman was always brave, strong, and even physically strong, and not suppressed at all.
Despite the cultural diversity in Dagestan, is there a feeling of being a single nation, being Dagestani?
Though Dagestan is not the local word, it came from Persia, and it means the country of mountains. And there are different, each expert names a different quantity of peoples and ethnic minorities living in Dagestan, and it varies from 36 to 104. But it never meant much in their everyday political life, because people usually knew 3 or 4 languages of their neighbors, and they all knew Turk languages. More educated people, they knew Arabic and Persian, so it was always easy to communicate. And in 20th century, of course, Russian language became this universal means of communication.
There are many stereotypes about Caucasus, and the region is seen as very vulnerable. How do you think these cliches can be broken?
Of course, the stereotypes do exist, and sometimes they have some background, sometimes they don't. But the main thing and the source of making people closer to each other is knowledge about each other. I think we must know about each other more. I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think literature also plays a rather big role in this destruction of negative preconceptions about each other. I receive different letters from readers, people from Siberia, for example, living in very remote parts of Russia. They write to me that Caucasus was very indifferent to them and very far from their interests. But now, after having read about real stories, about real characters, they see how alike are all people living on the post-Soviet space.
Thank you so much for your literature and for finding time to talk to the Voice of Russia.
Thank you.